All right, the purpose of this screen recording is to go over some key points about the early Ojibwe people living in mostly northern Minnesota and then east of northern Minnesota. This is Roman numeral 1, and it is a warm-up question, and you will answer this in your notes section, and you'll simply choose one of these 5 options to answer. And just put the letter next to the one that you answer. So write the question, then write your answer to it. How did you or your family come to live in Minnesota? Have you ever lived in another part of the country? What are some of your favorite foods during each season? Tell about a time that your life was affected or impacted by nature. What do you know about Ojibwe history? So you choose one of these and respond to it. You do not need to respond to all, just choose one. And that will be all you need to do under Roman numeral 1 warm-up questions. And essentially you're getting the notion that the Ojibwe people were migrating into Minnesota or moving into this new land that was called Minnesota and was occupied by the Dakota. Okay, Roman numeral 2 is called Ojibwe Migration, and you can see from this map that the Ojibwe started here by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and came down the St. Lawrence River. So we're up by modern-day Maine and parts of Canada, and came down the St. Lawrence River, and then they started going around the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and some traveled up around Lake Huron, the northern side. Others went across Michigan here to Lake Michigan, and then eventually upward and maybe rested here or moved on into Wisconsin. And once this group got here, so you see they traveled down the St. Lawrence, came up, stopped here, came around, came back here, traveled up to Lake Huron, and they traveled through this area, and then some groups migrated around the top of Lake Superior, some migrated along the bottom, and eventually ended up in Fond du Lac, Minnesota. Some remained in Wisconsin. Keep in mind, this migration took hundreds of years to achieve. And you're going to see that they made 7 stops and that a prophet told them that they were going to have to make this migration and that it would bring them to the place where food grows on water, which they eventually found here in northern Wisconsin and in Minnesota. And the food that grows on water, of course, is wild rice. So they came down the St. Lawrence River, through Lake Ontario, through Lake Erie, across Michigan, coming back up through Lake Huron, and then going a northern or southern route around Lake Superior and ending up in Fond du Lac, Minnesota, or northern Wisconsin. And again, this took hundreds of years, slowly migrating westward. So, we're still Roman numeral 2, Ojibwe Migration. Here's the map you just saw. And the Ojibwe A originally lived east of the Great Lakes, and that's in this region over here. The Ojibwe B moved into northern parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, the upper peninsula of Michigan, and parts of Canada, and you see that's Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. So those are the areas where they eventually settled. So groups were settling all along the way as they migrated, but eventually some groups ended up in Minnesota. The Ojibwe C migrated west because of European presence and Native American density on the East Coast. So there were whites coming in to the East Coast. That was pushing a lot of tribes up against these Great Lakes. And so there was a lot of Native people living in this region, all competing for resources because they were being pushed by a white presence. As a result, the Ojibwe people continued to go west looking for resources. And again, it took, several hundred years for this migration to happen. Roman numeral 3, Ojibwe Alliances. The Ojibwe, or let's start here, we can see somebody who's probably Algonquin, or spoke Algonquin, trading fur with Europeans. So the Ojibwe A allied with the Potawatomi and Ottawa nations in the 1600s when they lived east of the Great Lakes to fend off Iroquois expansion west. So this just shows that the Ojibwe were making alliances a long time ago, and it was alliances that were with other groups, the Potawatomi and the Ottawa, against the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were a very powerful nation in the East Coast. And so the Ojibwe joined the Potawatomi and the Ottawa to fend off or fight against the Iroquois, because the Iroquois were taking over a lot of the resources. So all the fighting and alliances were not always made against whites. Sometimes it was to fend off native invasion of lands or expansion. And the Ojibwe B maintained trade relationships with the French. So again, the Ojibwe were not always contentious or fighting against Europeans. A lot of times they were trading with Europeans. And in this case, it was fur, which we will find out about the fur trade in our next unit. So we are continuing with Ojibwe Alliances. And this shows an image from the Battle of Brule, and we'll see what that was. So the Ojibwe C, so notice we're on letter C, formed an alliance with the Dakota in 1679. So a lot of times the Ojibwe people were at odds with the Dakota, fighting against them. But in this case, they formed an alliance in 1679. Lowercase a, Ojibwe could move into Dakota land east of the Mississippi. So that means they could move into land that might be nowadays Minnesota or parts of Wisconsin that were run or oversaw or lived in by the Dakota. And the Ojibwe would sell Dakota furs to the French. So the Ojibwe became like a middle person that was willing to sell furs that the Dakota trapped to the French. So the Dakota would trap furs, they'd give their furs to the Ojibwe, and the Ojibwe would give it to the French. The French would give goods and money to the Ojibwe, and the Ojibwe would give those goods and money to the Dakota. The Ojibwe D ended the alliance with the Dakota in 1730. So no longer were they allied by 1730. They were not friendly at that time, or as friendly. And years of conflict between the Ojibwe and the Dakota followed the end of the alliance. So, and a lot of this conflict was over who had rights or who had access to land. Okay, you can see that this is Chippewa land, which is Ojibwe land, and that's in northern Minnesota. And then you have Sioux land, which of course is Dakota land, and that's in the southern part of Minnesota. So you can see that the Ojibwe began to eventually move in and take over great portions of northern Minnesota as the Dakota were pushed out. There were still Dakota people living in the northern parts of Minnesota, but for the most part that is Ojibwe land, whereas most land down here is Dakota land. So this is still Roman numeral 3, Ojibwe Alliances, and we're continuing. The Ojibwe E, so now we're on letter E, signed a treaty with the U.S. government formalizing the boundary between the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota and the Dakota in southern Minnesota in 1825. So the Ojibwe not only signed treaties with other native nations, like the Dakota, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, they also signed a treaty with the U.S. government. And in this case, it was to make this division. So it made it clear to the U.S. government, Ojibwe people are dealt with up here, and Dakota people are dealt with down here. And finally, the Ojibwe F paved the way for the U.S. government to negotiate further land cession treaties with each nation. So what does this all mean? First of all, it says this division, by saying Ojibwe live up here, Dakota live down here, it then made it easy for the U.S. government to say that if we want land from the north, we deal with the Ojibwe, northern part of Minnesota. If we want land from the southern part of Minnesota, we need to make treaties with the Dakota people. So when it says land cessions, that basically means giving away land. So those land cessions through treaties are when the native people gave land to the U.S. government. Okay, Roman numeral 4, Ojibwe Homes. And I want you to keep in mind Dakota homes and how they might be similar and different. So here is an Ojibwe camp right here, or village. So the Ojibwe A lived in wigwams, which is round, one-room homes made out of birch bark and animal hides. Lowercase a, animal hides for doors, and you can see that this might be hides here for the door. And mats woven from marsh reeds covered the floor, so that created kind of the softer floor, and they would weave marsh reeds together, which are a lot like the cattail reeds that we have outside of Breck. C, lowercase c, a fire pit in the middle, hole in the roof, so that the fire could come out, and you can see smoke coming out of here. So the fire pit was inside here in the middle, a lot like a teepee. And the Ojibwe built teepees for traveling and rectangular bark lodges for maple sugar camps. And we will see that the Ojibwe people are really known for traveling in a cyclical pattern where they moved throughout the seasons but then would return to the same place, or roughly the same place, every season. So they would use teepees when they were traveling because they're easy to put up and break down, or easier. And then rectangular bark lodges might remain at their sugar camps when they return to the sugar camps. And you'll see this seasonal flow when we get into the note-taking or the reading for the Ojibwe. 5, traditional Ojibwe education. And this is an Ojibwe boy in the clothing that he might wear. So Ojibwe A, so now we're in Roman numeral 5, and this is letter A. Ojibwe adults set a good example for behavior, so children learn by observing their elders. So very similar to the Dakota people, where you observed older people doing a job or how they behaved. B, children were instructed to do actions that taught values. So in other words, bring meat to those in need to teach generosity. So the children were given the meat to bring down to another family or another group to teach that value of generosity, just like your parents might have you do gift giving or do service work to teach you generosity. Very similar. Remember that generosity is a value that held kinship groups together or family groups together. C, girls were responsible for preparing hides, sewing clothing, building wigwams, because later on they would make clothing as well as put together the home, and so they were in charge of the home, a lot like Dakota women. Practice skills by using dolls. So young girls would use dolls to do clothing production to practice. And boys learned to hunt by practicing with a bow and arrow and small game like squirrels or rabbits. And then eventually they would graduate to hunting larger game like deer. All right, and then I will take questions from you when you return to class the next day. All right, thank you for listening.